Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Shields from Goulburn-Murray Water. I manage what we call the River Operations Planning Team at GMW, which looks after the water availability situations that we have. So we calculate what the seasonal determinations or allocations are, do the outlooks, and plan the overall flows that we have in the rivers that we manage. There's three things that I was going to cover off on today, and I know there's a few faces who were in a session last week we did with Murray Dairy, so if you've heard a couple of these messages, the new stuff will be at the end with the outlooks. First off, I'll go through the current seasonal determinations or allocations as they currently stand, touch on what the recent inflow conditions have been like over this year but also last year, just to sort of explain how we've come to be where we are in terms of water availability, and then have a look at the outlooks for next year that were released last Friday. So these are the seasonal determinations as they currently stand for the six systems that we manage there. The Murray's at 100%, Broken at 33%, Goulburn and Loddon systems both at 96% of high reliability water shares, Bullarook at 100% of high and low, and the Campaspe's at 100% of high. The New South Wales General Security allocation's been at 0%. They do have access to 97% of their high security entitlements. There's a fair difference there between the Victorian Murray allocation and the New South Wales General Security allocation. So there's two main influences on that. The first one is around the different allocation policies between the states. When we get to 100% of our high reliability entitlements, we start setting aside water for the following season. We were able to do that last year. New South Wales only start putting aside water for the following year when they get to 100% of their general security. Well, they do have some reserves for critical human water needs, but last year they only got to a 51% general security allocation, so they didn't have a lot of water available for this year. The other factor is the contribution that the ovens makes to water availability for Victoria. So we get all the benefit of the flows out of the ovens, which was actually quite, relatively speaking, productive compared to, say, the inflows into Hume this year. The inflows that we've seen over the last couple of years have resulted in lower storage volumes. What we've got on the slide here is the change in the storage levels at some key sites or key storages over the last 12 months. Across the board, generally about a 20 to 30% reduction at this time of the year compared to what we had this time last year. So Eildon's 23% lower than what it was this time last year, and that really factors into where we are in terms of the seasonal determinations in the Goulburn at the moment. We're only on 96%. We had this time last year at 100%, and that's part of that factor is less water in the storage. And being at 96% in the Goulburn, the only reserves we have for next year is what we call the early season reserve. So we've got enough water in the system to make sure we can operate the gravity network come the start of the season to deliver a carryover, but we don't have any water set aside to bank for new allocations next year. This map looks at the rainfall from July through to the end of September which are really the productive months for inflows into the dams. You can see there that the red colours indicate below average rainfall over that period. The white there is close to the average, and there's not a lot of blue there, but any blue would show that it's been above average. So across most of the catchment areas, it's been in that below average category. There's a little spot there of average close to the Eildon catchment, which I'll point out the significance of in a few slides' time. Mentioned we've had really two poor years of inflows into all of our systems coming off the 16-17 season, which was, as we know, a pretty wet year. Next couple of slides here look at the inflow volume, the percent of average, and also what we've got there, the chance of greater. Another way we describe how our inflows are going. For this slide's for the 17-18 season, sorry. So taking Eildon as an example, nearly 1,000 gigalitres of inflow, almost 70% of the long-term average. In 77 years in 100 we'd expect to get more than that, and in 23 years in 100 we expect to get less. So we're in that sort of lowest 20% roughly across most of those storages. And then that's continued on into this year. So Eildon, 700 odd gigalitres, 60% of the long-term average, but what we'd expect to get 82 years in 100. Hume, 93% chance of getting greater than that. So we're nearly in the lowest, or we are in the lowest 10% of the inflow records at Hume for the year to date. You can see in those catchments over to the west, over the Eppalock and Cancurran have been in the lowest 10% there as well, and there's not a lot of inflow into those systems. You notice that the broken system's on 33%, 5 gigalitres of inflow into Nilakudi this year. When we do our seasonal determinations at the start of the year, we'd estimate somewhere between 3 and 5 GL would just be lost to evaporation from the dam. So we're not really even getting or covering off our evaporation commitments. Similarly, for the Goulburn system, 700 gigs of inflow into Eildon. The high reliability entitlements in the Goulburn system are about 1100, 1200 gigalitres. Plus we add on losses to that, which is another sort of 400 to 500 gigalitres a year. We're well short of getting enough water in to source that water. Next couple of slides just look at these inflows on a monthly basis and compare those to, in this case for the Murray, compared to last year, long-term average and the 10-year average. So you can see that this year we're below where we were last year and well and truly below the long-term average. When we do our allocation outlooks, we publish a number of different scenarios, and they're all based on different inflow volumes. So this graph here shows the inflows we'd expect to get under the wet scenario, the average scenario, dry, and extreme dry. And this is how we've tracked against those this year. So I mentioned before we had that little spot in the rainfall map that had average rainfall in the upstream of Eildon catchment. That all happened in August. And it was the only spot in the Goulburn system that really got it and actually generated better than average inflows. So without that, if we'd ended up sort of just around here, without the benefit of that rain, we'd only be on sort of mid-70 allocations at the moment. So it generated about 20% to the allocation this year. The inflows downstream of Eildon, between Eildon and Goulburn Weir, contribute about 40% usually to the water availability in the Goulburn. That's tracked very close to that dry scenario, and you notice we didn't get that big jump up in August like we did into Eildon. And this was a year where we didn't fill Warringah Basin. So when we have those wetter years, Warringah Basin will generally fill, but we didn't get anywhere near that this year. In terms of irrigation deliveries, this slide just looks at how we've been tracking against different years for all the 6 gravity districts. So this year is this red line here compared to these other years. So there's a selection there. Probably the key point to note is we started irrigation demand picked up quite early in the year, but it sort of tailed off a little bit with lower general water availability because we're not seeing as much use particularly with high water prices. So we'll see how we go through the autumn, and depends where our final deliveries will end up. Dale's presentation that is coming up goes across these rainfall outlooks and current conditions, so I won't spend too much time looking at these, but just the key point I think is that the rainfall outlook for the next 3 months is sort of 50-50, so we'll see what happens there. Dale will also cover off on the climate influences much better than I can, but the key point there is there's an El Nino being talked about for quite a while, and the conditions haven't quite got to the threshold yet, but we'll wait to see what happens over the next few months there. The other thing to note is that autumns or at this time of the year, trying to predict what will happen in the winter spring is pretty difficult at this time of year. So we could really, anything could happen from here in terms of the season ahead. The Indian Ocean conditions though are really key to what's been happening in the last couple of years, particularly this year. So the conditions in the Indian Ocean haven't been conducive to rainfall. So that's been one of the contributors to the low rain this year. And on the flip side, it was the conditions in the Indian Ocean really what drove the 2016 wetter conditions. So nothing usually happens at the Indian Ocean at this time of the year, but again, we'll just have to wait to see what happens during those wetter months. So in terms of outlooks, we released the first outlook for the 1920 season last Friday, and we'll be updating that again on the 15th of May as we get toward the end of the irrigation season. We've got lower reserves this time of now compared to this time last year, and we're in a pretty similar situation to where we were at this time in 2016. We finished the 15-16 season with 90% on the Goulburn system. We're currently at 96%, so in terms of where we are now, we've got the same volume in reserve as we had in that year. But as I mentioned before, we've got that water available to operate the gravity network, so any water that's carried over, and particularly in the Murray and Goulburn systems, can be delivered. On the Broken, we don't have that water available yet, but that'll be the first water we'll be setting aside, is enough water to operate the Broken River. So inflows during the winter spring period are key to increasing the water availability next year. So the next couple of slides just look at these outlooks, and there's a few more scenarios here that we have published on our Northern Victorian Resource Manager website. So just talking through these quickly, the wets are 1 chance in 10, above average is 3 chances in 10, average is 5 chances in 10, below average 7 chances in 10. Dry is 9 chances in 10, very dry is 95 years in 100, and extreme dry is a repeat of 2006. So you can see with the Murray system, likely to start off quite low if it's dry, but progressing through to somewhere around 60% under that dry scenario. Again, there's a 1 in 10 chance we could have less than that. If we have a repeat of the inflows that we've had so far this year, we probably end up about 60% in February next year. On the Goulburn, quite similar numbers and progression, likely to start off low and then improve if we get better inflow conditions. This year, with those better inflows into Eildon, we've tracked somewhere between that below average and dry scenario, probably closer to the dry scenario. Again, a repeat of inflows this year would see us at about 65% by mid-February in the Goulburn system. Next couple of slides, I'll just flick through them quite quickly. This is the outlook for the Broken, so again, fairly poor under those dry scenarios. So, same for the Loddon, need some water there to improve things. The Loddons are sort of, and the Campaspear systems, where those dry scenarios, if you have a dry year, the rivers don't really run and don't get a lot of increased storage volumes there. Campaspear does have enough water to at least allocate some on the 1st of July. And the Bullarrook, small storage at the top of the Loddon, if it runs, it'll run well, and allocations will improve quite quickly. One thing I haven't mentioned before I wrap up is just the relative risk of spill. So with the update we provided on Friday last week, we did some rough numbers on the risk of spill. We're looking at around 35%, we think, at the moment on the Murray system, and where we think Eildon will get to later this year, or at the end of the irrigation season, sort of in the mid-30% capacity. So we think there's highly likely that we'll be below that 10% threshold early in the season. So just to wrap up, yeah, as I said a few times now, those inflows have been really low, and we don't have good reserves in storage. So the outlooks are there available to use to provide some of those scenarios to help with planning and things. But it's really too early to tell what will happen with the weather. So we'll just have to wait and see. But we'll be able to provide some more information and at least have some indications of what the winter spring might look like in the May update. So that was all I had to cover. So if there was, happy to take any questions.
Any questions?
Yep.
Is GMW compelled to take it up to 100% if water becomes available for this season? Or can they hold that back and make reserves for next year?
It's a really good question. I actually had a conversation with someone about that earlier. So good question. I had a similar conversation with someone about that today. So we need to continue to increase the allocations until we get to 100%, and up until the 1st of April. So we'll do it. The last update will be on the 1st of April, and then any improvements after that will go toward next year. Yep. So thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Very good. Oh, sorry, Kev.
Current flows, are we likely to get any increase on allocation?
So there's not a lot of water flowing into the system at the moment, but what we are seeing is we estimate our evaporation losses and river losses based on sort of a worst case. So we had that through January, so we didn't see much improvement, but the 1% improvements that we've been getting are because of the weather hasn't been as bad as what it can be in terms of evaporation. So we save on evaporation at Warringah Basin and Eildon, and that's where we get those little bits. But yeah, there's not a lot flowing in at the moment.